أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليه لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلون من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إنا أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وظللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات. آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بائے حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بائے حسین، چلتے ناکے سے گرایا خود کو جلتی ریت پر، چلتے ناکے سے گرایا خود کو جلتی ریت پر، گھٹنیوں کے بل میں تیری لاش تک آئی حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین، بس میں گھبرائی تھی خنجر تجھ پہ چلتا دیکھ کر، بس میں گھبرائی تھی خنجر تجھ پہ چلتا دیکھ کر، پھر کسی مشکل میں گر کر میں نہ گھبرائی حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین، کون تھا جو مرنے والوں میں نہیں تھا خوبرو، کون تھا جو مرنے والوں میں نہیں تھا خوبرو، بھولنے بیٹھی تو کس کس کی نہ یاد آئے حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بائے حسین، بہہ رہے تھے آنکھ سے آنسو تیری رخصت کے وقت، بہہ رہے تھے آنکھ سے آنسو تیری رخصت کے وقت، پھر کوئی آنسو نہ ٹھپکا آنکھ پتھرائے حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین، دیکھتی ہوں خاک مقتل کی تو بر آتا ہے دل، دیکھتی ہوں خاک مقتل کی تو بر آتا ہے دل، خاک پر میں کیسے کیسے پھول چورائے حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بائے حسین، آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین، پر محمد وآل محمد صلوات۔
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sayyid Hasan Rizvi, respected elders, dearest brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum, Jamia wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for all marhumin listed on the screen, as well as all other marhumin. Surah Mubarak al-Fatiha. Dua Shafai Maries is requested for all those in need here and elsewhere, as well as those listed on the screen. Let us recite together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. Ya Allah. The Senior Subcommittee invites all its jewels to a special event to celebrate Mother's Day and Father's Day. This event will inshallah take place this Saturday, February 19th from 2 to 5 p.m. Please register by tomorrow. Kindly contact Brother Zahir Somji, Sister Masuma Balwani, or Sister Sajida Tijani with any questions. Finally, ladies' majlis for the wafat of Bibi Zaynab alayha salam will inshallah be held tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Majlis will be recited by Zakira Sabah Bimani. Let us now invite Sayyid Hasan Rizvi to come forward for tonight's majlis. By Muhammad wa Muhammad salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين سيدنا والنبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع النفوسنا والطبيب ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. مؤمنين مؤمنات, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight on the 15th of Rajab, we are commemorating the tragic Shahada and passing of our beloved lady, Sayyida Zaynab bint Ali alayha salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. Previously, we had covered some of the sermon which she had addressed in Kufa. And I want to touch on some of that tonight, but in due time. When we think of Bibi Zaynab and the titles that she's been given, one of the most famous titles given to her by Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is that she is alima ghair muallima. Right? That she's this alima, this person with knowledge and ilm, ghair muallima, that she's learned, but she hasn't been taught. Now, we've heard that part before. What people don't normally know is that that line is not a separate hadith by itself. This characterization, this statement from Imam Sajjad to his aunt Zaynab was within a very specific context. And the reason in the beginning I mentioned the sermon of Bibi Zaynab is because this statement came at the end of her sermon. As Bibi Zaynab was continuing on her sermon in front of the people in Kufa. At the end of that sermon is when Imam Sajjad basically stopped her and interrupted, and he said the following words. He said, Ya Amma, O aunt, uskuti, be silent. فَفِي الْبَاقِي مِنَ الْمَاضِي اِعْتِبَارٍ. In what has already passed and everything else that remains, there's a lesson for those who you need to pay attention. And then he says, وَأَنْتِ بِحَمْدِ اللَّهِ عَالِمَةً غَيْرْ مُعَلِّمَةً. And yes, you are alhamdulillah, you are an alima غير معلمة, that you are a great learned scholar without having been formally taught. فَهِمَةٌ غَيْرْ مُفَهَّمَةً. That you have the ability to understand things and recognize things without having somebody to tell you how to recognize and understand them. إِنَّ الْبُكَاء وَالْحَنِينَ لَا يُرَدَّانِ مَنْ قَدْ أَبَادُهُ الدَّهْرِ. Verily, crying and yearning and longing will not return those who have passed away. Now, this is a very, very strange statement here. Very, very strange thing, especially since it's Imam Sajjad telling Bibi Zaynab, and especially it's Imam Sajjad interrupting Bibi Zaynab as she's addressing the people of Kufa. And then Imam Sajjad is telling her that, stop speaking, be silent, and then he says these words to her. Now, normally, when we hear only that middle part, that she's alama ghayr mu'allama, this sounds, of course it's a praise. That, she has this fada'il and fadila and these great characteristics. At first glance, when you put it in context like this, and you hear that the Imam is telling her to stop speaking and saying all these other things, now it seems a bit strange. So perhaps what we need to do is look at the actual context of why Imam Sajjad is mentioning these points, giving her these fada'il in the middle of these statements here. And maybe there might be some missing keys and lessons that are hidden here, and some elements that we've ignored before because we haven't been given the full context. And we realize that perhaps that this praise doesn't come in isolation, that there was a reason and perhaps a specific advice that Imam Sajjad was giving to her, and maybe that same advice you and I can also benefit from as well if we were to happen to be in this same position as Bibi Zaynab was in front of the people of Kufa. So let's explore this a little bit. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, the first thing Imam Sajjad says to Bibi Zaynab is uskuti, to be silent. Now, if you and I want somebody to stop speaking, there's obviously many different ways of going about it. You can tell them very formally, very politely, or you can be kind of blunt in somebody's face, impolite and informal, right? You can say, could you please lower your voice? Could you please be quiet? Silence. Or, you can tell them, be quiet and raise your voice. Or use harsher words if you want. Most of the time, it'll depend on what the person's actually saying, in the context of what they're saying, and of course, your own situation too. Meaning, if somebody is speaking the truth, they're speaking something beneficial, but you're a type of person that doesn't enjoy beneficial conversation, you may tell somebody harshly to stop talking, right? If you don't like what they're saying, then you'll tell them to stop. Or the other way around, you're a person who only wants to hear beneficial conversation. So when you hear somebody saying something that's not beneficial, that's harmful or damaging, again, you may be harsh and tell them to stop talking. So your status and the other person's status will help determine which way you want to end somebody's speech or conversation and discussion, right? Now over here, the ulama have a conversation that in Arabic, there are multiple ways of telling somebody to end their kalam and to stop speaking, right? Because we know Arabic is a very precise language. For example, right, the word or the phrase, the command that's used here is uskuti, which is coming from the word sukut, which most of you would know. Sukut just means silence. But there's other words in Arabic for silence, like samt. Samt mean from sad mim ta, and sukut is with a sin. So the ulama of linguistics talk about what are the differences here. Now, the problem is that conversation, although it would be interesting to bring it up, it doesn't really help us over here. Because in linguistics, the word sukut or uskut, when it's used, it can have a positive meaning and it can also have a negative meaning. You can use it in a positive situation, right, when you're just politely telling somebody to stop. Or you can also use it to tell somebody to stop if they're saying something that doesn't make sense or is incorrect. So that doesn't really help us in that sense. So we again need to think about the other context clues that are available and see if we can get a better understanding of what's happening here. So what we need to think about first is, well, why is Imam Sajjad telling her to stop in the first place? Why would anybody, now again, first we take the position of somebody like Imam Sajjad. We're dealing with a ma'asum here. So the status of the person who's saying to stop speaking, that's clear and that's known, right? There's no issues there. So somebody in that position, a ma'asum who's telling somebody else to stop speaking, there's only two possibilities for what the other individual is saying. Either that other individual, meaning Bibi Zaynab, either she's saying something which is not haqq, which is batil, which is incorrect, which is false. Now, a'udhu billah, that's impossible, right? That we know that's impossible. That can't be the case. But of course, we see that in other situations, the imams would do that. When somebody was saying something incorrect or invalid or damaging or demeaning, whatever it is, they would tell people, to stop speaking. And in fact, these are the types of proofs that are used by historians and ulama when they talk about, some historical issues, right? This issue comes up sometimes regarding, people talk about whether the hijab or the chadors or whatever, the coverings were taken from the women of the Ahlul Bayt after Karbala or not, right? This is a debate some people, unfortunately, have brought up. One of the pieces of evidence that's used is that in some of the poetry that was recited in front of the imams, they would mention the fact that their khimar or khumur were taken from them. And the imams remained silent. So ulama use that as a piece of evidence. They say, look, if this was false, if this was incorrect, they would have stopped them right there. Because we know, as we've talked about before, in poetry, the imams only allowed haqq to be spread. They wouldn't allow exaggerations. So some ulama use that as evidence and say, look, if the hijab was not taken, if the khimar or whatever they were wearing, the jilbabs were not taken, then the imams would have definitely had to say something. Because as representatives of reality, of haqq, they have to stop everyone, including poets, from saying something which is an exaggeration. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Okay. So Imam Sajjad is not stopping Bibi Zaynab from saying something which is batil and incorrect and wrong. That's an impossibility. So that means then, obviously, logically, she must be saying haqq. She's saying what's true. Okay, but then that sounds even stranger. We could understand why Imam Sajjad would stop somebody from speaking if they were saying something incorrect. If somebody, like Bibi Zaynab, like an alama ghayr mu'allama, is saying something and it's correct and it's true and it's powerful, why would he get her to stop? Why would he tell her to be silent? So this is the question we need to think about. And perhaps what may help us understand this is if we think about real life conversations that you and I might have. And some of our teachers in Qum, those who were experts in the sciences of hadith, they would mention this point a lot. They said, obviously right now, we are in an age where things are easily taken out of context, right? We're in an age of sound bites and little clips. And a lot of people, after a certain sound bite or a part of their speech or whatever is taken out, somebody uses it, right, to defame them or insult them or cause a fitna, then that person could say, oh, look, it was taken out of context. Oh, look at my tone or whatever. You can tell that I was joking. Or you can tell I was being sarcastic, right? Something like that. And we could go and check that. We can go see the rest of the speech. We can go see the rest of the lecture or the rest of the conversation. We can listen to their inflection and intonation and the way they're speaking and tell, okay, was this person joking or not? Were they serious or not? Or is this just excuses that they're making? So we can do that now because we have recordings. Our teachers would say, look, we don't have that with the Ahlul Bayt, obviously. We don't have, recordings of the Ahlul Bayt speaking. Obviously we don't. And our teachers would mention this because they said, look, it is very, very hard to figure out the irada and intention of the Ahlul Bayt when they're speaking. You can take any hadith that you want, almost any of them, and you can read it in a very sarcastic way, you can read it in a joking way, you can read it in a harsh way, you can read it in a loving way. And the only people who can figure out which way makes the most sense are those who are Ahlul Hadith, meaning they have the context if there's a greater speech involved, and sometimes that can help you out. They look at who's being spoken to, meaning the mukhatabin, the audience, listeners, that can help them out. Or they can say, look, we know the normal way that the imams would speak on this subject, so this is probably how they were addressing it, right? So people, the muhaddithin, the scholars of hadith, have these different clues they can use to apply it over here. We can perhaps do the exact same thing here. And some of what the ulama say is, look, sometimes what we can do is apply our own linguistic rules that you and I use in common language. Look at how the imam is speaking, see how it would make sense in common day language, and see what would make sense and what would apply. So what do I mean over here? Let's open that up if you can recite another salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I'm sure every single one of you have been in this situation. You're with somebody and they're involved in some sort of discussion or conversation, and then it gets a little heated, so that conversation or the discussion starts to turn into an argument, and then, a fight. And then that person is getting heated. They might start screaming or saying things that they shouldn't be saying. Now, if you are the person who's witnessing one of your friends or family members, somebody you know that shouldn't be in this state, that's getting out of hand and they're losing control, they're not able to control what they're saying anymore, what do you say to the person like that? One of the first things that you do is you tell them, okay, that's enough, stop, calm down, right? Don't speak anymore. That's the first thing you would do. Then you'd probably tell them, look, there's no point in continuing what you're saying, stop what you're saying, right? You'd be a bit specific. You would say that, look, if you continue, you're going to make it worse, right? If you keep saying and going down this line, it's going to be worse, either for you or for the person you're speaking with. So, just stop. It's no longer beneficial what you're doing. And then, assuming that the person's right, you may say, look, I agree with what you're saying. What you're saying is right. I'm on your side. And then they finally end with, but look, it's not worth it to continue this conversation. It's not worth it to continue this fight. So there's that sort of formula that normally we use. We tell the person to stop, right? We try to take them out of the situation, just tell them, stop speaking. We tell them that, look, there's no point, or it's not beneficial to continue. Then we agree with them usually and say, look, what you're saying is right. You're on haqq. The other person's wrong. But again, we emphasize it's not worth it. It's not beneficial to continue speaking anymore. This is a normal way that you and I would deal with somebody else with akhlaq. We'd try to deal with somebody to try to get them to stop, going forward in a manner that's not appropriate for that individual, right? So now, let's go back and see, does this sort of formula apply to what's going on with Bibi Zaynab alayha salatu wassalam? Let's look at the context. This is, again, while she's going through this sermon, this fiery, passionate, powerful, harsh khutbah, right? She's, chewing out, insulting, and degrading the people of Kufa, basically, right? And we've gone through some of these. I'm sure most of you have read the full thing. I hope you have. She has very, very harsh words for them. And at this point in the khutbah, they say that everybody present, they were crying, they were wailing. The eldest from amongst there, they were, almost falling over because of how overcome with grief and regret they were. They say that the beards of these old individuals were soaked. Right? It's almost like they couldn't even breathe anymore. They were crying so much. They felt so terrible. I'm sure many of you may have been in sort of a situation where, you've seen somebody who's such, they're in such a state of depression and regret that they can't control themselves anymore. That what they're doing, that emotional sort of height and peak has to be ended there. So this is the sort of context. So perhaps, what is Imam Sajjad doing then? When he sees all this happening, then he stops Bibi Zaynab. He says, okay, that's enough. Silence, right? Uskuti. That's the first thing. Just like we would do, we would tell the person to stop. He's telling her, okay, that's enough, right? I think they've heard enough. And what is the second thing he does? فَفِي الْبَاقِي مِنَ الْمَاضِي اِعْتِبَارٍ. What you have said already is more than enough. And if there are other things that they need to hear, other things that they should know, then everything else that you've talked about and all the other events that have transpired, in that is an i'tibar and a lesson for them. There's an ibra for them. They can figure it out on their own. You don't need to use any more words. In the same way where, in your situation, if you're with somebody who is, speaking like that to somebody else, you'd say, look, you've done all you can. You said all that you could have. If they don't understand, if they don't change their mind, if they don't see why they're wrong, then that's their fault, right? There's no point in continuing. Perhaps that's what the Imam's saying here. Like, look, they've had enough. There's no point in continuing that. And then, this is now where the praise comes from. The part where we would normally say, I agree with what you're saying. This is where the Imam says, وَأَنْتِ بِحَمْدِ اللَّهِ عَالَمَ غَيْرْ مُعَلَّمَ فَهِمَةٌ غَيْرْ مُفَهَّمَ. You are an alama without having been taught by anybody, and you understand things without having somebody tell you how to understand things. Now, just a few points about this, because this obviously requires its own lecture. What does this mean to be alama ghayr muallama? And many ulama have addressed it. But in a few short words, there are two possibilities for what's being said over here by the Imam to Bibi Zaynab. One is that he's basically putting her on a status saying that she is being divinely inspired. That she is a ma'asuma, just like the other members of the Ahlul Bayt. Right, that's one option. The other option is that Imam's exaggerating, saying, you are so knowledgeable in this and that, when it's not the case. He's just saying that you are very, very knowledgeable, but of course you've been taught. So this latter option doesn't make any sense. We know the Imams don't exaggerate like this. So it has to go back to the first. The fact that he is speaking about a certain maqam, a daraja, and a station and level that she has reached. And ulama like Ayatollah Jawadi Amali, hafidhahullah, have described this and said that this is showing us through these words that Bibi Zaynab was able to reach a certain maqam of wilaya that other people haven't been able to reach. Now again, what does that mean? What are the different levels of wilaya? Again, that's a separate conversation. For us, what I believe is important is to understand what sort of factors led her to get to this level. Because she is ma'asuma, no doubt. She is alama, no doubt. But the isma that she has is different than the isma of the other ma'asumin. And this is sometimes where we, I think, get into trouble here. Sometimes people charge us and they say, you exaggerate the qualities of the Ahlul Bayt. And normally, we disagree with them, say, no, we don't exaggerate them. You just underestimate the qualities of the Ahlul Bayt. You don't understand them. But in some cases, these objectors are correct. What we end up doing is putting all of the members of the Ahlul Bayt on the same level, and that's not the case. Yes, Bibi Zaynab alayha salam has a high station and level. Abu Fadl Abbas has a station. Ali Akbar has a station. Qasim, An, Muhammad, Abbas, they all have these great stations. But it's inappropriate to put them at the same levels as the 14 ma'asumin. This is just not the case. And the ulama, the way they describe it is that one level of isma is a wajib, shart, and condition for the 14 ma'asumin, which is isma takwini. It's an existential isma which has been given to them from birth. The other type of isma is isma tahsili, one that you have to work towards and you have to acquire on your own. And that goes for every one of us, including you and I, including somebody like Bibi Zaynab or Kulthum or Hadat Abbas or any of the other non-original ma'asum members of the Ahlul Bayt. And this is not diminishing the quality of Bibi Zaynab. This is actually showing her how great her quality is actually. The fact that she and others in her same status were able to reach these high levels, to become alama ghayr muallama, to be able to reach a station of wilaya through her own efforts, right? Now, how was she able to do that? There's two major factors that we should focus on if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The major one is going to be, because we have two, it's nature and nurture, very simply. For anybody, for any one of us, for any person in history, it's nature and nurture which determines our maqam and our level. Now nature, obviously Bibi Zaynab, she is the daughter of Nahj al-Balagha and Khutbah Fadak. So her nature is obviously pure, right? Mutahhir, mutahhira. She has this line of isma throughout. So the possibilities of her are going to be different than everybody else. Her brothers are imams, right? Her grandfather is Rasulullah. Her grandmother is Bibi Khadija. So she has this pure line. So she has the best of natures. That's easy. But then in her nurturing as well, of course, she's being raised by the greatest murabbin, the greatest trainers possible. So of course, there's almost zero possibility that she's going to turn out anything other than ma'asuma, right? So it's going to be impossible, basically. So that's the sort of nature-nurture thing. But for us, what we need to think about is, when we're thinking about the way that we engage in our tarbiyah, well, we have to keep these things in mind as well. When we are trying to raise individuals, we say, I want them to be like Abbas or Ali al-Akbar or Qasim or An, Muhammad or Bibi Zaynab. Like, okay, fine. But make sure you take both of these things into consideration too. You have to look at both nature and nurture. Now, nature, you and I can't really do anything about, right? If we have certain spiritual illnesses and diseases in our ancestry, we can't do anything about that, right? That's just the way that it is. It tells us our starting points, basically, right? I mean, right now, if you think about the child of a marja growing up in Iraq or Iran, their trials, their tribulations, their tests are going to be different than you and I being raised over here right now, clearly, right? So really, the one that plays the biggest role in our households is going to be, nurturing. What sort of tarbiyah are you and I involved in? And they say that the reason somebody like Bibi Zaynab is the one who's in Kufa teaching tafsir al-Quran to everybody else is because she's learning this tafsir from Imam Ali, from Bibi Fatima, from Imam Hasan, from Imam Hussein. And she was in a constant state where she was learning all of this. So when they say that when we're talking about her isma and her ilm, it wasn't divine knowledge given to her right from the beginning. Say no, it was because she had the propensity, she had the capability, the imkan and the possibility, and then she was being taught and trained by all the ma'sumin in her household. And she used that and she acted upon it right away. And when you have that knowledge and you act upon it, this is the formula so that you can grow station by station by station. It's a very simple formula. The same formula that's been given by every single one of our ulama and urafa. You know something, act upon it. The minute you act upon it, Allah opens up another door for you. It's very simple. Once you do that enough, once no teacher can teach you anything anymore, no human teacher can offer you anything, even a ma'asum can't offer you anything, then the only teacher left is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you get to a station where you get inspiration, ilham, direct wahi comes to you. Not the wahi of the anbiya, but a different type that belongs to the awliya. And this is what they say was the maqam of Bibi Zaynab bint Ali alayha salatu wassalam. So let's think more about when we're trying to raise a Bibi Zaynab or the likes of her in our household, that our tarbiyah needs to match up. We can't just simply say, oh, I want my daughter to be like Bibi Zaynab. I want my son to be like Hazrat Abbas. Okay, well, you need to be like their parents. They're not going to magically turn out that way unless you yourselves understand what it takes to create and raise a Bibi Zaynab and a Hazrat Abbas. It's not easy. And that means for parents, your struggle will be much more difficult than it is for your child. You will have to destroy your own nafs in order to show them how to destroy their nafs. That's why the ulama say that 0 to 7 phase is so crucial. You fail there, it's going to be very, very difficult as you go further and further away, as they get older and older. So, we've talked about the 3 points so far. First, Imam says to be silent. Then he tells her that, look, what you've said is enough for them. They can take a lesson from that. Now we don't need to continue. You are alima, ghayr mu'allama. You understand without having somebody tell you. You've reached a high level. Meaning, in some way, perhaps he's saying, you should know better, actually. You should know that this is the limit for how you should be speaking. You shouldn't go further than this. And that's why he ends with these words. Innal buka wal hanin. Crying, yearning, longing, wailing, this extreme form of grief, لا يردان من قد آباده الدهر. This sort of extreme grief and crying will not bring our loved ones back. People who have left because of time, they will not come back. Over here now, there's 2 possibilities for why the Imam is mentioning something like this. And again, this will depend on context clues and what we understand of the personality of the Imam and of Bibi Zaynab. One possibility is that he's trying to inform them that, look, these individuals that you're speaking to, right, these Kufans, or anybody for that matter, for them, they're crying, they're wailing, they're doing all of that, but anything more won't have ma'rifah. They've reached their limit. Nothing else, none of this crying is actually going to help them anymore. As was in the words of Bibi Zaynab and Imam Sajjad themselves in those sermons, if you remember, right? They said, you're crying for us, where were you in the battlefield of Karbala? Where were you then? You're crying, your tears are useless. Right? These are the words of the Ahlul Bayt. So some say that this is perhaps what the Imam is suggesting, that he's trying to tell both Bibi Zaynab and the Ahl Kufa who are listening, look, your huzn, your grief has a limit. Don't just cry for the sake of crying. Don't just show grief and oh, I wish I was with Imam Hussein. Ya laytani kuntu ma'akum. Don't just say this haphazardly and just out of nowhere. You need to have ma'rifah and the reason and why you're saying this and why you're crying. Now we're not taking away the value of buka and crying. Of course the Imams have advised this. But as we've said, just like with poetry, although it's been recommended, poetry needs to have ma'rifah. Sadaqah, just like it's been recommended, we need to have ma'rifah in how we perform it. In the same way, buka, huzn, azadari needs to have ma'rifah behind it as well. Look at the immediate history after Karbala. Around the time of Mukhtar, most of you know, this movement of the Tawabin. What did they do according to most historians? This movement was a waste. They just wanted to go and give their lives out of this extreme grief that they had for Imam Hussein. When they were being told, this is not the way you need to go and mourn Imam Hussein. You're wasting your lives. You're wasting your grief. Be more strategic about it. Go to your Imam and see what he's advising. Go to the awliya. Go to the ulama. See what they're telling you to do. Don't let your emotions take over your aql and your logic and your reasoning. Wilayah doesn't go away because your emotions have taken over. The system of wilayah always needs to remain intact. And also this is why we have scholars throughout history, like this famous Dr. Ali Shariati. Although he was a sociologist, he wasn't an alim obviously, but he has this famous work that many of you are familiar with, Red Shi'ism versus Black Shi'ism, right? Where he talks about how over time, the Shias, especially post-Safavid era in Iran, they shifted from what he calls Red Shi'ism, this socio-political, social welfare sort of Shi'ism, which went out, they helped people, they would feed people, they would take care of each other. It was a communal-based, a ma'rifat-based Shi'ism. He said they shifted towards Black Shi'ism, meaning they just dressed in black, they cried all the time, this and that. He said this, according to Dr. Shariati, was a form of propaganda. This was a plan by the people in charge then. Because they said, look, if we can get you Shias just to cry and sit in your homes all the time, that means you won't be going out and fighting dhulm. You'll be crying for those who are mazloom, but you won't actually go and fight against those who are zalim. You won't go out and fight against the systems of dhulm because you'll be too busy mourning. In other words, the system of azadari requires and necessitates some sort of action. Now what that action means, it's going to vary in every situation and every society. Every place will be different. And this is exactly how we see it within the lives of the Ma'sumin, which we've discussed, I think, a bunch of times. Every single imam, their way of explaining and carrying on azadari was different in every single time. Every single imam was different. And even if you look now at all of our different cultures, there seems to be, some shared elements, but then there are some also exclusive elements. We'd say the Iranian Revolution would have been completely ineffectual if it wasn't for that movement of azadari behind it. All right, and these are the words of Imam Khomeini and the others. May Allah bless all those who were behind the movement, that without the message of Imam Hussein and the Shahadat of Karbala, we have no revolution, we have no inqilab. All the other resistance movements that we know that exist, even ones that are not Shia based, they also say that if it wasn't for the stand of Imam Hussein, our movement would have no meaning, would have no morale, would have no power. Now we ask ourselves the same thing. Again, you all have been in the conversations before. We don't need to, beat a dead horse, but what really are we doing with our current forms of azadari? Do we really think that they have ma'rifah behind them? Or is it the type which, unfortunately, is without ma'rifah, which is causing us to cry and mourn and grieve without taking the proper action, whether it's for our own spiritual growth, for the growth of our family, for our community, socio-political growth, whatever that happens to be. Right? Again, that's its own discussion as well. What type is that? That's something that, at least from this part of the sermon or the advice from Imam Sajjad, it's something for you and I to think about. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. This is if we take one meaning from these last lines where the Imam is addressing the Ahl Kufa, saying that your grief needs to be done with ma'rifah. And he's basically telling Bibi Zaynab that, look, they've reached their limit, There's no point in making them cry anymore. There's no point in making them regretful or remorseful anymore, because anything else will be a waste of time for them, because now they've reached their limit. That's one element that some ulama have hypothesized. There's another possibility, which is slightly more controversial, and I'll just mention it quickly before we end. And they say that this was actually specifically addressed to Bibi Zaynab herself. That the Imam is not addressing Ahl Kufa directly, at least. He's, with these words, these last words, that crying and yearning and longing and extreme forms of emotional expressions, they won't bring back our loved ones. That this advice is actually for Bibi Zaynab herself. And again, for most of us as Shias, we're like, this doesn't make sense. How could the Imam say something like that to her? If we take the other context clues, it becomes a possibility. And again, not definitely yes or no, but it's something to think about at least. The context clues are what? One we already talked about before, that her isma is not like the isma of the other ma'sumin. She's not one of the 14 ma'sumin, meaning, not to say that she makes mistakes, but her maqam is different than, for example, a Bibi Fatima, right? It's not the same. So there are limits to her isma to some degree, meaning she has room to grow. Others would bring in the other context clue that in Karbala, on Ashura, before Imam Hussein alayhi salam goes out to battle, when he's speaking with Bibi Zaynab one-on-one, he is advising her about what? About her emotions. Saying, look, I know that you want to express your emotions in a certain way. All right, I don't have time to bring the Arabic there, but most of you, I think, are aware of what was said between the last two in those final moments. He said, don't rip your collar, don't pull your shirt, don't slap your face, don't scratch your face. He's giving her this advice. Now, some will say that, that she wasn't actually going to do that. But why would the Imam say that if she wasn't going to do that? This was perhaps to give her that reminder that women, by default, and again, this is going to be the controversial part, there is a necessary part of them which requires this emotional expression. But that emotional expression, which is how they perform their amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, that has a limit. Now, where is that limit? Who defines that limit? This is where the idea of wilaya comes in. The limit for emotional intelligence will come in with wilaya. Imam Sajjad, being the wali, being the imam, tells Bibi Zaynab, like, okay, you have been using your maqam, your station. You are a representative, you are a madhar, a manifestation of the jamali, names of Allah, the most beautiful names of Allah, right? Being a woman. You use these emotional, feminine tactics and techniques and methods in order to wake up individuals, like people in Kufa. But that has a limit, and that limit is the border, which we call the Jalali names. That's a border that you can't go past. When a woman goes past that border, then she has done tajawuz. She's trespassed into a place that doesn't belong for her. And this is where somebody who is Ahlul Jamal wal Jalal, like the Imam, is able to say, okay, that's enough. This is where you can't go any further. Just like Imam Hussein was saying, look, you can express grief like this, but don't do it like this. Imam Sajjad is also saying, look, I'm still the Imam, I'm still the Wali. You can go and make these people cry, but now you have to stop over here. And that's why he's saying, now it seems you're going beyond. You're going to start to go beyond that. And that's why perhaps he's telling her, you are alima ghair mu'allama. Pay attention to your fitrah, you know better. You understand without anybody telling you. I'm just advising you right now, this is a point where you need to stop. And this is where we have a hadith which may help us from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. Where he says, uqul an-nisa fi jamalihin. That the aql, which sometimes people say intelligence, of women is in their jamal, in the manifestation of the beautiful names of Allah, where jamalul rijal fi uqulihim. The beauty of a man, however, is in their aql, in their uqul. And there are whole books written about and commenting on what this hadith actually means. And we've talked, we've given some points about the difference between jalali, jamali, how this manifests in men and women, but we don't have time to go all into that. This is just a possibility given by some about how the Imam, given his station, saying that, look, Bibi Zaynab, in your maqam, you have reached the limit of Jamal and now you're trespassing into Jalal. This is where it has to stop. This is where you shouldn't go any forward. You can't go past this mark. As any person, any wali in the same situation needs to do. That any wali in their own household needs to make sure that the women in their household express Jamal to the utmost, but when it goes beyond that, they need to stop. And the same thing for women when they're looking at their husbands or their walis in their house. They have to make sure that their husbands are expressing their Jalal. And when it gets too Jamali, that has to stop for them as well. Now again, this is a bigger conversation. Inshallah, maybe in another discussion, when we have time, we can go through that on another night, inshallah ta'ala. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, to summarize, Bibi Zaynab, at the peak of her khutbah, is told by the Imam to stop her kalam, to remain silent, not because what she was saying was incorrect, but because she had reached perhaps the peak of the emotional expression of what she needed to do, her Jamal. The Imam is then saying, look, there's enough information for anybody else. You don't need to continue. It may not be beneficial for you or for the listeners to continue. You're somebody who's beyond this. You know better, so you don't need to continue. And remember that there is a limit to emotional expression. And this is a guide for you and I who are azadaran. And this is a guide and a lesson for all of us to know that it's not just about sawab and, how do we get the most blessings? Do we just cry all the time and wear black and give niyaz and tabarruk? Or is there more ma'rifah required in our azah? And in terms of the Jamali and Jalali names, we have to make sure that we are manifesting it the way that Allah and the Ahlul Bayt have advised us to. Not in the way that modern society is dictating the roles of men and women. Because as the Ahlul Bayt, especially Rasulullah, had predicted, towards the end of times, we'll see that these roles will be reversed. And when these roles are reversed, he said, this is when you'll start to see chaos and fasad fil ard, which clearly we are in the middle of. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Besides being known as alama غير معلمة, besides being Aqila of Bani Hashim, besides being Al-Kubra or Thaniya Zahra, right, the second Zahra, all of these names are talking about her fadail and her greatness. But sometimes when members of the Ahlul Bayt are given other names, it's names which break our hearts when we remember them and we recite them. When we think about, for example, Sayyid al-Shuhada, it's, yes, in one sense it's a fadila, but in another sense, when we hear it, it reminds us of the heartbreak and the grief and the bala and the tragedy. When we hear that the Imams, when they were gharib al-ghuraba, that breaks our hearts as well. But no one has the title of al-Masa'ib. And sometimes somebody had asked, why is it that we compare sometimes the azah and the grief of the Ahlul Bayt? Well, it's so that you and I can keep things into perspective, so that when we see how their lives play out, when we see the sabr that it took for some of these members of Ahlul Bayt, then we're able to understand how they're able to practice this in their lives, and we take lessons from this. So yes, we need to understand the masa'ib and the gham and the life story of Bibi Zaynab. All the members of Ahlul Bayt dealt with difficulties, but I challenge anybody to bring me an example of the masa'ib and musibat of Bibi Zaynab. You can't find anybody like it. That's why nobody else is Masa'ib. From childhood up until the end of her life. She's born in Medina, according to most narrations. Born now when her grandmother, Bibi Khadija, had already passed. And many historians say that when she was born, when Rasulullah was holding her in his hands, he said, I advise those who are here and those in the future, I advise them to take special care of this granddaughter of mine, Zaynab, because she looks like my wife Khadija. What sorrowful words it must have been for Rasulullah to say that. And how difficult it must have been for Bibi Fatima to hear those words as well. And now look at Bibi Zaynab's life as she's growing up. A young child, she sees and witnesses the passing of her grandfather, Rasulullah. Only a few months later, she sees the dhulm that takes place to her mother Fatima. She sees the huzn in the face of Fatima. She sees the way that she's being told to hide her grief when the ghusl is happening for her mother Fatima. She sees her own father, Imam Ali, after advising them to be quiet during the ghusl, that Imam Ali, her own father, is banging his head against the wall, screaming loudly. She has to witness her father in such a state. After her father passes, after she's mending to her father's wounds, to the strike on his head, now she has to witness the passing and the strike and the poison in her brother's body, in Imam Hassan's body. She has to witness arrows in the body, in the tabut of her brother Hassan. And now, all the way finally, she makes her way to Karbala. And finally, when she's in Karbala, even Imam Sajjad did not have to witness what happened to his father, Imam Hussein. Bibi Zaynab was the one until Zaynabiyya. She's the one out there looking. She's the one out there watching alongside Bibi Fatima, looking, and when she sees somebody sitting on the chest of her beloved brother, she's the one watching what's going on there. Tell me now, who is al-Masa'ib? Tell me which other woman has to witness something like this? What other sister is watching her brother like this? Even Bibi Masuma didn't have to witness the dhulm that happened to Imam al-Rida. Only Bibi Zaynab is there witnessing what happens to Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein does not have to see the dhulm that's taking place to Sakina as they're going from Karbala to Kufa, from Kufa to Sham. Imam Hussein and Imam Sajjad do not have to be there for every single part of Bibi Sakina's dhulm that's there. Bibi Zaynab is the one who's taking care of the body and looking at the marks on the back of Bibi Sakina as she's performing the ghusl over there. Bibi Zaynab is now going back outside of Medina. She's the one with the broken back. After years and years and years of grief, after years and years of sabr, finally when she makes her way back into her home, after years of this, finally when she makes her way into the house, now she's able to say, Wa'ana wa Muhammada. Finally a mother is able to express her jamal and her emotion. ألا لعنة الله على قوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
یا حسین یا حسین پکارے عابد مزتر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے پکارے عابد مزتر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے خبر لو یا علی حیدر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے پکارے عابد مزدر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے نبیو حیدر کرار نے مرکز کو چھوڑا ہے چلے ہے شبر و شبیر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے پکارے عابد مزتر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے کہاں ہے فاطمہ کی قبر پر حوروں نے زہرا چلو اب شام کو رو کر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے پکارے عابد مزتر کے زینب دفن ہوتی ہے سجاد میں زینب ہوں میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں بازار جفا سجاد میں آج ماہ کوفیوں کا میرے چلنے کی جا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میرے سر سے کئی بار چھنی چادر، بلوے میں نبی زادی پھر وائی گئی در در، مل جائے ردا مجھ کو اور میری دعا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میرے دل کو یہ درد ستاتا ہے، سر غازی کا نیزے سے جب خاک پہ آتا ہے، سر میرا کھلا دیکھے غم سے برا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا معلوم ہے ادا کو غازی کی بہن ہوں میں، بے دشت ہے وہ غازی پابند رسن ہوں میں، یاد آئی وفا اس کی جب پاس رہا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا موت آئے گی زندہ میں میری بالی سکینہ کو، کیا جا کے بتاؤں گی بیمار مدینہ کو، غم دل کے اٹھانے کو اب باقی بچا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا بازار ستم میں تھا زینب کا جب عالم، مظہر میں لکھوں کیسے ظالم نے کہا جس دم، ہے کون تیرا وارث زینب نے کہا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ ردا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین و محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔ بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتيه فيها طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان. عجل الله فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وظهور الأمر ورحمة الله وبركاته.